Hello. My name is Caitrin Chappelle. I'm Associate Director of PPIC's Water Policy Center, and I'm thrilled to be joined by all of you today to talk about our latest report, Managing Wastewater in a Changing Climate. I also want to acknowledge, we'll start by acknowledging the other co-authors of this report, especially the ones that are in the room, including Henry McCann in the back and Kurt Schwabe, who just made it in the nick of time. And then especially acknowledge the research supporters of this, funders of this work, which includes the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, the S.C. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, and the U.S. EPA. Without their support, this work would not have happened, so we thank them very much. So let me just quickly run through what we're going to do in the next hour and a half. Everyone should have an agenda on their seat. I'm going to start by giving about a 20-minute overview presentation of our report's main findings and recommendations. And we're going to follow that by a panel discussion moderated by Kurt Schwabe from UC Riverside. The bios for the participants of the panel are in the agendas, except we had one quick last-minute change due to flight schedule delays. I won't call out the airline. And we've replaced Dan Ferris from Coachella Valley, and we're really lucky to have Adam Link from the California Association of Sanitation Agencies join us. And then on your way out, there are copies of the full report you can grab as you leave, but it's also all available online. The slides from today's report, from today's presentation, will also be available online. Today's event is being videotaped and webcasts. So hello, everyone joining through the web. We're going to finish at the end of the panel. We're going to have about 20 minutes or so for audience Q&A. Please wait for a microphone when it's time to ask questions so that the folks who are joining us by webcast can hear the questions. Okay, let me look at my things. What did I forget? Okay, later today, everyone should receive a short online survey about today's event. Please fill it out. Let us know how we did, what we can improve. And finally, please silence your cell phones. Okay. So we're here to talk to all of you about our latest report, Managing Wastewater in a Changing Climate. So let's just take one quick second to define wastewater. The wastewater sector in California plays a crucial role in water management. It collects all the water that we use in our businesses and homes, and it treats it before releasing it either back into the environment or to be recycled to protect both public health and the environment. We did a report back in 2017 that took a look at California's latest drought and its impacts on urban water supply agencies. And we learned through that work and work done by others that the wastewater sector was also impacted by water scarcity and reduced water use during the latest drought. And so what we decided to do was take a closer look at this sector specifically and ask the question of how policy can help build resilience in the wastewater sector to both short-term changes due to drought and long-term changes due to climate change. We did this work using an online survey of wastewater managers. We also held focus groups with folks from the sector and consulted with state agencies. For more information on this survey, there's a full technical appendix for this report that's also available online that gives lots of details on surveys, questions, and answers that could be available for you as well. PPIC has taken a look at the type of climate pressures that are going to impact our water sector. So what I wanted to do was to quickly summarize the impacts of the wastewater sector on a changing climate as a way of setting the stage for today's discussion. Climate change will bring more severe droughts and longer-term water scarcity, and in order to adapt to that, there may be reductions in indoor water use that will reduce flows to wastewater treatment plants, and we'll talk a bit more about how that could impact the sector. Over the long term, there might be changes in the type of water that we use, which could change the water quality of the water that is heading to wastewater treatment plants. Also, climate change is going to lead to lower flows and higher temperatures in our rivers and streams. And a lot of California's rivers and streams actually rely on wastewater effluent as part of the flows within the ecosystems. So there will be changes to those ecosystems due to climate change, and so the interactions between changes in wastewater and those ecosystems could create some issues. On the other hand, more extreme wet periods, like this last year that we saw, especially in the form of atmospheric rivers, could increase flood risk to treatment plants and may lead to unplanned spills. And finally, sea level rise will affect the wastewater treatment plants on the coast and along San Francisco Bay. Our report focused specifically on the challenges related to water scarcity and drought. And through that, we've identified three main challenges facing the wastewater sector. And they are maintaining water quality in the face of reduced indoor water use, making smart recycled water investments, and balancing conflicting objectives within watersheds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through each of these three challenges and talk about them and talk about some of the recommendations from this report in building resilience against these challenges. Okay, so the wastewater sector is inevitably linked to water use, indoor water use. The amount of water we use inside our homes and our businesses determines the amount of water and the quality of water that is flowing to wastewater treatment plants. And it's the job of the wastewater sector to maintain the quality of water coming out of their treatment plants regardless of the changes of what's going in. So looking forward, the wastewater sector will have to think about two main changes to indoor water use. The first is they're going to need to adapt to periodic short-term water conservation in response to droughts. And the second is they're going to have to adapt to long-term increases in urban water use efficiency. I'm going to talk about both of those. So on the first one, California is a drought-prone state. Our climate is highly variable, and climate change is going to bring even more droughts and more water scarcity, as I already mentioned. So the latest drought from 2012 to 2016 had the driest 4 years stretch on record and also the two hottest years on record. So in many ways, we can think of this as a drought of the future and a way to learn some lessons in how to prepare. So what happened during the latest drought? Just as a reminder, in case people either weren't in California or forgot. During the latest drought, urban water suppliers used conservation measures to reduce water use across the state. These measures were implemented even more aggressively due to a statewide conservation mandate that to reduce urban water use by 25% against 2013 levels. And as you can see from this figure, water use significantly and rapidly declined during these times. As you can also see from this figure, water use levels have persisted at lower levels since the end of the drought, meaning that per capita water use has not and may not rebound to pre-drought levels. And so for the wastewater sector, it's the changes in indoor water use that really impacts the flows that are heading to wastewater treatment plants. And while the assumption is that the majority of these savings came from reducing outdoor water use, we do know that there were some changes to indoor water use as well. And one way that we know that is because people told us. So we asked the wastewater agencies who responded to our survey some of the impacts that they saw during the latest drought. And the largest thing that was seen was that over 3/4 of wastewater agencies who responded to our survey experienced reduced flows, influent flows to their treatment plants. And over half, about 60%, saw a change in the quality of the water reaching their treatment plants. We, from our survey, learned that this caught a lot of agencies by surprise, and in some cases, the amount of reduction was fairly significant. Back to my previous point about how it's the job of the wastewater sector to maintain quality coming out of the treatment plants despite what's happening coming in. Good news is that we didn't see any major water quality issues during the latest drought from wastewater treatment plants. They did a really good job of adapting to this change, but it still caught many by surprise. And about 1/4 of our respondents to our survey saw that they saw a change in the water quality coming out of their treatment plants during the drought. So some of the consequences of these changes in flows we learned from our survey include both collection and treatment challenges. A lot of the things that we heard from our survey respondents was that the suddenness of these changes is what led to a lot of the issues. We saw issues in treatment processes, so enough of a change in what they had to do to either require more chemicals, increase energy needs, or supplement wastewater with some other type of water supply. There was an increased deposition of solids in the conveyance system, leading to the need for increased flushing. And some agencies experienced corrosion of infrastructure or increased odor problems. All of these challenges led to, for some agencies, increased costs, and for some may they think may have led to long-term damage to their infrastructure. So in future droughts, we should think about how we can plan for either similar or sometimes more severe disruptions to operations if they're not planned for. But the impacts of changing water use is not about just what happens during droughts. Agencies will also have to adapt to long-term reductions in indoor water use. So even before the latest drought, in California, per capita water use was declining, and we expect that to continue, especially because of recent state policy changes based on the Making Water Conservation a California Way of Life initiative. And local agencies on top of that may even implement their own conservation strategies as a way to adapt to water scarcity or accommodate population growth. So although these longer term shifts may not result in the same acute challenges that were seen by the wastewater sector during the drought, they could have implications. One scenario is that they'll just feel them more incrementally over time, or in some cases it may mean adjusting to the decline in investments in new collection and treatment systems or equipment. But all this will require lead time and planning to assess how the changes in indoor water use and influent will affect operations. And one thing that's really interesting to keep in mind is that indoor water use is not systematically measured. So the information, is some uncertainty about the information that might be needed for wastewater agencies to plan for these changes as these policies take effect and people adapt to water scarcity. Whoops. So what can we do about it? We had just a few thoughts on this particular challenge. And it's really around the keeping in mind how crucial it is that the water supply and wastewater systems work together in both information sharing and in planning. These sectors are linked, but they're not always managed together. We have hundreds of water supply agencies, hundreds of wastewater agencies. There is some overlap, but it's not one-to-one. And so our first recommendation is to increase information sharing and coordination with water suppliers. This will be important for both adapting to changes in water use during droughts and changes to water use due to longer-term water use efficiency. We also, also about 2/3 of our survey respondents agreed with that when we asked them whether or not they needed to increase their coordination with their local water supply agency. We also think that wastewater managers and wastewater agencies need to begin to plan for future droughts. Currently, wastewater agencies are not required to plan for droughts the way water supply agencies are, and we think this needs to change. And lastly, we think we need to do a better job of understanding the vulnerability of our wastewater system to these changes in water use. We have some good lessons from the latest drought, but more work needs to be done, and we think this is a place that the state can play a nice role in building the understanding of a vulnerability of our system. Catch up on my notes. The next major challenge for the wastewater sector The next major challenge for the wastewater sector is responding to the growing demand for recycled water. So like I mentioned, wastewater is the source for recycled water around the state. Our survey respondents indicated that many agencies are considering investing in recycled water after the latest drought. While some already recycle water in some way and to some level of treatment, and some even have wait lists for their recycled water customers, many are considering investing in recycled water projects for the very first time. And this is being done obviously in response to water scarcity in the latest drought, but also forward thinking for building local water supply resilience. The motivations for these investments can vary, but all agencies are making some decisions in light of some uncertain conditions, specifically the impact of changes in water use on recycled water production. Something else we learned during our survey is that about 40% of the agencies who saw reduced influent flows during the droughts saw impacts to the recycled water production. So the amount of water that was coming into their treatment plants that they relied on for creating recycled water, the reduction in that led to some issues with how much water they were creating. And so recycled water is often thought of as a drought-proof supply, but there is a little nuance to that. As people use less water during droughts, they might not have as much available. Changing influent characteristics of the water flowing to treatment plants can also cause challenges. For example, if the influent is saltier, it may require higher levels of treatment to be recycled, or it may limit its end use. And lastly, evolving regulations and state policies could create a much larger demand for recycled water than we see now. So recent policy has allowed for recycled water to be used in new ways, such as augmenting surface water supplies. And there's right now work to be done on statewide policy around direct potable reuse, and that will create a whole new customer base. So our recommendations around building resilience for this, I lost my page. For this, so I'm going to wing it. For this sector are twofold. The first is to look at planning for recycled water at the regional level. So as I mentioned, coordination between water suppliers and wastewater sector is essential for building recycled water investment plans to understand the water use needs, but also the demand. And making these decisions at the regional scale can help with both cost and efficiency. The second would be to focus on flexible recycled water investments. If we see changes in indoor water use over time due to water use efficiency, it wouldn't be prudent to build recycled water projects now based on the information of indoor water use. So flexible investments that can respond to changing water use, changing climate, and changing demand. The last challenge I want to bring up is related to how these two connect with downstream users and the environment, and about balancing the conflicting objectives within watersheds. So many wastewater treatment plants in California, except for the ones that discharge straight to the Pacific Ocean, release the effluent from their plants to rivers and streams. And oftentimes that water is then relied on for either ecosystem needs or downstream users. So adapting to either declining water use or meeting increased demand for recycled water may mean less water for these users. And climate change could exacerbate these conflicts as ecosystems become more vulnerable or as demands for water become higher during times of scarcity. So we have a few recommendations for building resilience in this, for this challenge as well. And the first is about building understanding. So the areas in which we're likely to see these high trade-offs between recycled water or changes in water use and downstream users are watersheds that, as I mentioned, rely heavily on wastewater effluent for either supporting vulnerable ecosystems, or there are downstream users who rely heavily on that water for their own water supply. So we think it's really important that the state especially identifies the watersheds that are vulnerable to these changes in wastewater management. We call these high trade-off areas. The second recommendation is in these high trade-off areas to find ways to develop decision-making tools so that wastewater and water supply agencies can work together to understand the impacts of their management changes on the ecosystems especially. We think regional plans for recycled water will help navigate some of the trade-offs between water supply agencies, but some of the trade-offs related to ecosystems need to be better understood. And there's a good example of this happening in the LA River right now, where they're using some collaborative science to understand different investments and how it's going to impact downstream users and the river. And lastly is for the state itself to take some time to evaluate the trade-offs caused by its own policies. So the state's statewide policies related to water use efficiency, recycled water, and environmental flows, I hope I've made the case, are all connected. And so the state taking time to understand how their impacts from one policy area impact another will send a signal to local agencies that the state understands that the trade-offs that are being made there, and will probably help set more realistic goals and timelines and an understanding of how to move forward. So I just want to say that while the wastewater sector has a lot to adapt to with changing water use, growing population, and changing climate, awareness of these challenges is growing. According to our survey, many wastewater agencies after the latest drought are planning adaptations and investments to adapt to some of these changes. So this is a moment where it's an opportunity for action to build on that momentum. And we think that local agencies should work closely with one another, with water supply agencies, but also with the state to build a more resilient future. And that is it. Thank you very much. So I'm going to take this moment to invite Kurt and our panelists up to the stage for a panel discussion. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I made it up here. I think Dan was probably wrestling with the Coachella crowd, as I think I was as well. I was supposed to be here like at 9 o'clock. Anyways, it makes for an interesting day. Thank you all for coming here today, and I want to thank Caitrin and Henry for doing the heavy lifting on this report. It was really a pleasure to work with them, and both Henry and Caitrin, as well as Ellen and the Water Policy Center from the PPIC, for recognizing the importance of shedding more light on this timely topic. It has consequences throughout California, but also I think in terms of leading the world, what we learn here can be applied both in the US and globally. With that said then, I also want to thank our distinguished guests today who are going to help us kind of navigate some of the challenges that we're confronting. Because Adam is a late fill-in, you don't have the bio on your seat. So I'm going to probably read just a little bit of Adam's bio, more so than I'll read of the other two distinguished guests today. So Adam Link leads a variety of legal, regulatory, legislative initiatives for the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. He regularly works with state, federal regulatory agencies, the California legislature, and other trade associations and industry groups, while also managing several operational aspects of the association, including communications, budgeting, and conference planning. You do about everything.
Just about everything. You name
Holy
it.
catfish. Okay. Adam holds a degree from the University of California, Santa Barbara, the University of Pacific, McGeorge School of Law, and is a member of the California Bar and a registered lobbyist. And then I'd like to also introduce Nina Hawk, who is the Chief Operating Officer for the Santa Clara Valley Water District, and her bio is on your seat as well. And finally, Jelena Hartman, who is the a senior scientist with the State Water Resources Control Board. I want to thank you all for helping us out today. Let's give them a round of hand. So Caitrin ended up, and she used this word trade-off quite a bit. I'll just monopolize in a minute or two. She uses the word trade-off, and as an economist, it's interesting. One of the first lessons a professor in my undergraduate course I took years ago wanted us to remember after our first pitcher of beer after the final. He said, I hope you remember the lesson that there are trade-offs or opportunity costs with every action we make. That was one of the 3 lessons. If you meet me afterwards, I'll tell you the other 2. But if you think about it, I mean, we commonly refer to this as there's no free lunch, right? And so this is kind of a tenet of economists, right? So even today, even if you got someone paying for you, there's still a time cost, right? And for those who haven't had lunch yet, that's not an issue, right? So anyways, when I think about the wastewater treatment agency, the wastewater management and use, there's certainly unidentified and identified trade-offs associated with it. While there are opportunities, increasingly unique opportunities to augment local supplies, there are also costs. There are costs that are going to be incurred by the agencies themselves, but there are also costs that they're going to incur from actions from others. And they're going to impose costs on others because of their actions. So the idea of really recognizing this issue of trade-offs, and we always kind of feel that identifying the trade-offs help inform good policy. So that's kind of what part of this report is about, is saying, what are these trade-offs? What has these agencies gone through during this past drought? And the more we can understand these consequences, the more informed policies we can develop and move forward in the future using this valuable resource more efficiently and equitably. So with that said, our panel's goal today is to discuss the current state of wastewater management in California and its interactions with water use, recycled water demand, and watersheds, and in particular the environment. We also hope to uncover some looming challenges, particularly with regards to climate change, and identify opportunities to inform policy to build resilience. So resilience will be a recurring theme in today. We cover 4 topics today. They are wastewater and water use, wastewater and water recycling, wastewater and downstream users, and finally, policy changes. So without delaying any further, let me pose the first question to the panel. And in particular, I want to pose this first question to Adam and Nina, but then Jelena, if you want to add something, feel free. I'm sure things are going to arise. So the connection between wastewater management and changes in water use became very clear during our recent drought. What was the biggest challenge or frustration your agency confronted during the recent drought related to wastewater generation, use, or management?
And I can take this first, and I'll have to be able to speak not on behalf of my agency because we're a trade association of agencies, but just some of the things that CASA's member agencies have told us that they've experienced over the course of the drought. I think one of the big ones was impacts to their collection systems, including odor, corrosion, things of that nature. That was probably one of the big ones that they discussed with us. Another was related to their treatment processes. So I think the report does a very good job of pointing out that influent quality changed, and then in some cases even effluent quality changed. That was a big one over the course of the drought that they were sort of figuring out how to adjust to. I think the biggest thing that folks are now trying to deal with is, this trend of water use has been declining over the course of years due to increased efficiency in indoor appliances, things like that. But the drought really exacerbated that. And the question is, well, is that going to go back up, or is this sort of where we're at for the future? I think that's probably the biggest long-term question, and that will inform how we deal with and how we address these things like odor, corrosion, impacts to our treatment trains.
Very good. So I'll follow up from our agency's perspective. As it relates to the effluent, we're looking at two major items, and that's quality and quantity. Those both were impacted during the drought, specifically on the effluent side. We do take water right now from one of the regional wastewater facilities, and we purify it for recycled water use. So we then blend it with Title 22 water for purple pipe or for MPR use. So we did see significant impacts as it relates to declining flows within the systems, which you articulated very well, Adam, in terms of the collection systems and the treatment plants, but we also saw it on the effluent side. And so what we had to do is we did have to make modifications to the treatment on the purified water side for recycled water purposes. In addition, we also had the concerns about quantity. So we became looking at how we move that water around through the purple pipe system and effectuate and provide sufficient amount for the system became of interest and concern for us. We're also working on planning efforts where we're focused on these two very items and really looking holistically at the region to better understand how declining flows and or projections for demand and use into the future would impact further expansion of recycled water.
I think I'd like to really follow up on what Adam and Nina had shared and to provide kind of like a broader context for where the state was. And we kind of sensed some of this frustration and some of these challenges because the recent drought has been labeled as the most severe in the modern history. And during that time, some of the communities were running out of water or were close to running out of water. So the state was really dealing with that sort of emergency. And so with no end to drought in sight, the state, what we thought was acted diligently and imposed mandatory restrictions. And, we did start to hear whispers of impacts to the wastewater, but that really remained in the background because the forefront was dominated by the most pressing issues at the time, which during the drought was really, will these communities have enough water? And I really want to thank PPIC for putting a spotlight on this issue. Now we are not in an emergency, and having this conversation now and this event now is really an opportunity to do a better job of thinking what worked, what didn't work, and take lessons from that, because is this going to stay a low flow situation? Is it going to change? We need to plan, adapt, and be prepared because the next drought will come.
So to follow up on that then, so it did seem like there was this uniform treatment of a lot of the agencies out there, whereas they are very heterogeneous. Has there been discussion within the State Water Resource Control Board about how you can make more informed decisions based on the heterogeneity that exists across these agencies so that there's more than just gallons per capita per day?
Well, we're having this conversation right now. I mean, right. 2018 water efficiency legislation put the criteria for us out there to meet, to come up with what's the efficient outdoor use, come up with an approach so that it's customized budget-based approach for each agency tailored to its climatic conditions. And we are having this conversation now and really welcome the opportunity to have as many people engage and tailor that approach so that it actually works for us in the future that we are facing.
Great. Since we have here, is there anything you want to say to her?
No. It's great to hear. I do. I do think that we're a wholesale water agency, so we were very much an advocate for California as a way to conservation as a way of life for Californians, and we implemented extensive conservation measures as well, which included funding, anything from helping the water retailers reduce their use. I mean, we were a huge advocate of that. At the same time, we're also looking at how do we from even just an imported water perspective, kind of take our reliance off the delta and create new supplies in counties. So you have two very different things, and one based on the environment and not having as much reliance on the delta, and then bringing back into in-county use and trying to develop new supplies. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy where you're now pulling together two things where you're trying to make things work in the space of climate change, but also there's some prohibiting or some challenges, I would say, as it relates to just the behaviors of the community that we saw and how that could impede that. And so we really have to step back and take a more planning look at it, look at the different levels of requirements that are currently in place today, not just with the State Water Resources Control Board, but also the Department of Water Resources. You know, we have the urban water management plans, how we do projections, and how we look at those in the space of how we're developing supplies as well.
And not representing the water agencies and focus sort of mostly on the sanitation side, you know, I can't really speak to that, but I could say that in general, there's a lot of unique stories at individual agencies. So we found that very broad, universal, sort of across-the-board approaches don't always work. And there really does need to be those kind of tailored plans, what's going on in your watershed, what's going on with your agency. You really need a closer look at those things in order to get an effective policy through.
Great. On that same token, so I know we've kind of focused on the state, though, but and there is some information that seems to need to increase in terms of exchange between the state and individual water agencies. But what about water and wastewater treatment plant agencies? But what about the wastewater treatment plant agencies and the water agencies? Is there kind of this mechanism to encourage more interaction and collaboration among them? Because that seems to be kind of this first part, what the issue amounts to. Or looks like opportunities to increase information exchange, I should say.
I can speak for our region. So right now within the county, we're actually doing what's called a county-wide recycled water master plan. It's the first time we've actually taken it county-wide, regional. We have done individual plans for the POTW. So we have partnered as a water agency with the wastewater agencies to do individual planning and looking at how we can effectuate effluent from one system or one plant. But this is actually looking at 4 different plants. And what we're finding is that while we thought we were just going to do a programmatic and then eventually do one major regional project, the reality is we're seeing a lot of different ideas and ways that we can approach the various treatment plants because they are in different service areas. They happen to be owned and operated by cities, not sanitation districts, which creates quite an interesting dialogue. These are land use agencies that are now looking to make sure they can have sufficient water supply for their building as well. But of course, we are trying to effectuate the continued conversation about water conservation, trying to find the best beneficial use. And we're starting to play in the space of looking at recycled water as also what do you do in times of drought with recycled water. So that's a real heavy conversation. A lot of agencies, we've been very fortunate to have ample water supply, but since the last drought, it's really conjured up this other layer of thinking that it is also a very valuable resource, especially as we look at developing it for multiple uses.
Is there, do you want to add
Oh,
to
no, I
that?
would just add that collaboration between the water and wastewater agencies is huge. I think there's often a misunderstanding that, oh, it's water, so the same entity is dealing with it. And in some cases, that is the case, maybe if you're a city or something. But, you know, in a lot of cases, the wastewater agency has 20, 25 different other water providers in their service area. And so making sure those relationships work, ensure it works out for both parties, that's huge in the whole process.
So it seems like a huge investment to get that information flowing to the right place. And so, Jelena, is there a role for the state in trying to help encourage or facilitate these sorts of relationships?
Well, information sharing is incredibly important. I mean, I first, find that having a conversation ahead of time and planning and investing time now when we can anticipate what the impacts are, we definitely have a role. Because while impacts may have been, unexpected and we were dealing with one emergency, from this point forward, we can't say that these impacts are unexpected. We know that next drought is coming. This is California. We've always had droughts with climate change. They're only going to become longer, hotter, and so when it's drought, it's going to be the need to conserve, whether or not the state imposes restrictions. And I think this is our reality to manage and to adapt to, and having a conversation ahead of time and planning and being prepared for that drought when it comes is what we can do, and the state can help facilitate that conversation. Our policy, our tools are funding guidelines, permits, policy. I don't know how much appetite there is to do through any of these venues. So having these conversations with smaller and larger agencies sharing information and us collectively figuring out what the path forward is the thing to do.
Great, thank you. In the report, we talk about the impacts to wastewater from both short-term conservation and long-term efficiency, indoor use efficiency. How are your agencies thinking about these two different pressures and how to prepare? So this is more so for maybe for Nina and Adam.
So for indoor specifically, I mean, obviously that's what contributes to the collection system and to the wastewater entities. We have a number of great things in California, the green building codes, which have effectuated quite a huge surge and change in water use indoor naturally, and of course the last drought. So that really changed behavior, and both we had changes in actual use. For how that moves into the system, we've actually been looking at both the pros and cons of how we would then take that water and do either a decentralized or centralized facility, and what would make sense from a water development standpoint. But from the kind of the source water standpoint, we want to continue to encourage those things. We don't want to necessarily say don't do additional indoor water savings. They are necessary and they are very important. Getting back to the theme about the application of outdoor use, while it's not as extensively thought about in recycled water, I think it's also going to become a lot more of a hot topic and a lot more engaging. Also the quality of that water. If that water for outdoor use is not necessarily good enough, for instance, salinity in the water specifically, TDS might be too high. Some of the plant life out there and horticulturalists know this, something called sodium absorption ratio of these plant lives, and if they don't get adequate water with a lower TDS, they then won't thrive. And so in the kind of the vein of creating great urban spaces with lots of greenery, we've got to find kind of a nice balance of adequate investment for treatment and also thinking about the environment at the same time. So
Great, thanks.
I think that important distinction you made is the difference between short-term and long-term. I think short-term folks are looking at, okay, we're seeing these impacts, how do we address them? Universally, are there certain areas in a particular collection system where this is occurring more? Are we able to learn lessons from that and extrapolate them to other agencies across the state? Do different treatment trains work as flows go down? Those are the kind of short-term things I think agencies are doing now to address them. I think the long-term issues are a little more complicated, dealing with things like capital planning, asset management. If you're not sure how low your flows are going to go, how do you build a $100 million plus facility? How do you know how many MGD your facility has to be 30 years from now, which is what you're building in terms of time frames? And so that kind of capital planning aspect on the long term is really significant. And I think recycled water too, right? If you're building a large scale recycled water project, you want to know what your influent is going to be so that you know what your effluent is going to be. These are all calculations that going into making, recycled water project pencil out. And if there's some uncertainty there, it's really difficult for agencies to kind of make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to agree with Adam that the long-term declines in indoor use is something that we don't yet have a good handle on, but it's important to understand, how low we can go, because it's evident that the indoor use trend is going to continue to go downwards, driven by the plumbing code and the increased appliance and fixture efficiency. And understanding how low it could or should go is important for planning. And I think the wastewater agencies will need to adapt and to be able to properly plan for that. This is the space to work on that.
I do want to add, we've actually been studying that very thing as part of our regional master planning. We've actually been looking at how we can analyze what a kind of the projection would be in terms of, based on declining flows from the last drought, what it would be into the future. And one of the things we are dialoguing about right now with the wastewater agencies is, how much do you think you need of a buffer? What do you think that space might look like for you? And so since they are land use agencies in their cities and they do projections for water demand use and what they would see in the future in terms of population, we are asking them to really give us their best case, and we're trying to add that buffer into the analysis, because if not, we're going to go and evaluate based thinking we have all this wastewater effluent that we can both develop and use, and then we're going to fall short for both environmental discharges and flows and requirements there, along with declining flows. So we're actually having that very conversation right now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into my next question then, relating to wastewater and water recycling then. Is the wastewater sector set up to accommodate this new growth? and what tools are needed to ensure smart recycling and investment?
Representative of the wastewater agency.
There we go, yep.
Yes, exactly. This is my hat right now. I think we're absolutely set up to accommodate the growth. I think a lot of our agencies are excited about it. I mean, they're really pushing recycled water project. We want to be at the forefront of it. I think the biggest thing I would warn about is that there's no real universal solution on that front. As much as we want to promote recycled water, as much as we think we're ready to do it, the amount that a particular area needs to recycle is different depending on the watershed, depending on the needs, all those things. So I would be very wary about anything that says, you have to do this or this works across the state in all these circumstances. That's something that really needs to be watershed based, individually based. So that's a big point. I think probably the biggest issue that a lot of our agencies face is funding, and you'll hear that a lot from other folks. Clean Water SRF gives out about $1 billion a year, and I believe last check there was about $7 billion in need, or in folks that want projects and just can't get them. Mm-hmm. So hugely oversubscribed. We have these federal programs like WIFI or Title 16. Always more applications than there is money to go around, and a large chunk of those is recycled water projects in California. So that's sort of a barrier that needs to be overcome before our agencies can really move forward in a big way with some of these things. And I think the third one is probably the role of, and I think Caitrin mentioned or someone did, direct potable reuse. So they're developing the framework. That seems to be the trend, kind of where things are going in recycled water, but we don't know exactly what that looks like. And so until you know that, how do you plan for it in 10, 15 years from now when you're building these large projects if you don't know what that looks like? So that's sort of a big factor that our agencies are considering too and probably need in place before we're able to really move.
Is there any information asymmetry or lack of information from the state, you think, that could be provided to give you more certainty so you can make those types of investments, or from water users upstream, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but I would say it's very fluid. There's a lot that we don't know about it, and so guarantee today on some front may not be a guarantee tomorrow. That would be a little disconcerting, but when you have more information, more framework in place, I think people are more comfortable moving forward.
So going back just to, Nina, you brought up this topic of indoor water use, and my kids, 9 and 13, they certainly know not to run their the faucet when they're brushing their teeth and such. Although, given that I know my water goes down to Orange County, I kind of say, kids, this is what's happening here, right? And they kind of look at Dad. You can't say that. But we are taught from an early age, and we're indoctrinated about indoor water conservation. And I think that maybe there has to be this shift, or at least education. In some focus groups that we've done, we found that when you ask people, what do you do outside to save water? They say, you let your lawn die. That's probably the main response we receive, at least in our focus groups. And there's a lot of other things you can do. Do you find that there's a need for more efforts and maybe messaging and marketing education on the outside?
We had dealt with this in the last drought, and interestingly enough, we actually saw the MPR customers, so the purple pipe customers that we're using for irrigation, actually also lessened the use on their green spaces as well. So the messaging for the potable use actually did find its way into the recycled water world within our service area. And so that was kind of an interesting natural behavior change that we saw. The watering so many days a week, we've kept that in place, and you still see that today. So what's kind of interesting is kind of that impact of that last drought has let people look not just the indoor but also the outdoor. I would say that we don't want to discourage that conservation that's happening on outdoor as well, because if it is going to be a limited resource, we know we have a declining flows concern of future droughts. We know there's going to be environmental requirements or flows to be mindful of. When we go to develop it, there's only going to be so much of that wastewater effluent. And so I think just the continued messaging is really important. Yes, could one argue that less wastewater is being developed because there's lower indoor use? Yes. However, in the big scheme of things, we're going to make the best use of what we have in terms of resources, both natural and those that we are cycling through the system. So an area or a space that we're really curious about too is how does that water look when it starts to cycle through systems, and what will the quality look like over time? So we're actually doing a lot of work on the effluent side where we're looking at CECs. We're trying to really do some wetland type projects where we're trying to see what we can do for effluent as well. So
I think what I've heard is that we need more messaging to conserve water outdoors, because that is really our biggest opportunity to conserve water. Almost half of our water use, especially during the summer, is outdoors. In some areas year-round, a large portion of our water use is outdoors. The lawns do not have to die, but this is not Scotland, and having climate-appropriate landscapes in California, native vegetation is incredibly beautiful. It provides habitat. There are ways to change our landscapes, preserve them, have them beautiful, and conserve the water. I think the big takeaway is we are here because it's wastewater, focusing on the indoor portion, but I think I've heard there's a lack of messaging for the outdoor use, and that's definitely one of our really primary ways that we can conserve water without affecting the wastewater sector as much.
Right. Yeah, and I know that at least down south where I'm from, there's certainly lots of efforts and investments in promulgating outdoor changes in landscape and things like that. But it seems like educating kids when they're younger even and starting that whole process seems to have paid dividends on the indoor side now, but we can certainly see these dividends in the future because we'll have to. All right, so great. Now I'd like to transition into wastewater and downstream uses, and in particular produced water and environmental water. So wastewater effluent in many cases is an important source of flow for environmental purposes and other downstream users. So the question is, how is your agency considering or addressing the risking conflicts surrounding the use of this increasingly valuable resource? And to kind of lay a little foundation here, I had some MPP students that looked at relating effluent discharges and impacts on stream quality, and we just had a heck of a time trying to find any systematic data at even the yearly level from more than one monitoring point. So it's been a real challenge in that environment, but it seems like it's becoming increasingly important with water scarcity and less flows into the streams. So.
Start on that one.
Yep.
I think it's a significant issue for a number of our agencies. I think probably the biggest things that they look for when it comes to the trade-off between environmental flows and recycling water is clarity. So they want to know, okay, what are those standards in this particular water body, and what are they going to be for the future, because we have to make our planning decisions surrounding that. So in the 1211 process, it was sort of addressed as part of the recycled water policy, updated the State Water Board, but I think there's some more work to be done. I think Caitrin mentioned that they're doing the work in the LA River, doing some modeling there. That might serve as an example of what to do going forward, but I think probably the biggest concern is just that lack of certainty where you're not sure exactly how much needs to go into the system, and therefore you're not able to know how much you're allowed to take out of the system and recycle. And so that feeds into your planning process, your decision-making trees, all those things. So they're both very important considerations, but I think really what's needed is kind of figure out, okay, what are the parameters? How do we operate going forward?
And do we know if there's investments at the state level in trying to coordinate that or move that forward?
Absolutely.
Okay. Next question. No.
Obviously, the State Board has been encouraging and promoting reuse and water recycling and efficiency and water conservation. And with reuse, there is a potential to affect in-stream flows and fish and wildlife and public trust resources like recreation. And so the water boards recognize this, and we do have the process that's in the report, the wastewater change petitions, that would evaluate for any recycled water project what those impacts are. And really the need to better understand and to define what these environmental flow needs are came to a forefront along the Los Angeles River. And the example is in the report, but that's why the water boards, both the State Water Board and the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, partnered with local municipalities to do the Los Angeles River flow study. And we are hoping to better understand what's that cumulative impact of all the projects that can affect in-stream flows. What's that impact? And it's not just water recycling. We are talking about low-impact development, capturing the storm flows, reducing the incidental urban runoff. All those things have the potential to affect the flows, and we are hoping to really, after this study is completed, have based approach and the technical tools to really define these ecologically protective flows that can be protective of specific species and habitats and protective of specific beneficial uses. So we really are hoping to learn from that study, and while we continue to promote expansion of recycled water use, to understand how to do that in a way in these high trade-off areas, how to really do that in a smart way.
Yeah, I'll add one thing. It's kind of getting back to Adam's point and touching on the balancing act. What's really important, even from a water development standpoint, is actually the NPDES permit. So even though that's found on the wastewater side, that effectuates that planning, and that really gets into what is required under the permit in order to do discharge, whether it be into a creek or stream or the bay. And then more importantly, as we look at recycled water, and let's say, for example, you're doing IPR instead of DPR one day, but before you do DPR, IPR, there's a RO concentrate or a brine discharge that might be associated with that, for example. And so one of the spaces that we're also playing with right now is better understanding, can we discharge under the same permit as a wastewater agency? If so, what does that look like? Or would we have a separate NPDES permit? So there's definitely some real interesting technical nuances and the regulatory framework for that. And I think that's an area where wastewater, water users, and the state board could really work together to figure out paths forward to develop the new supply in conjunction with everyone's requirements and what's good for the environment.
Great. Yeah, and just to echo that, Jelena, I know that last fall you came down, the State Water Resources Control Board, and had a workshop on effluent-dominated streams and started that information gathering exercise, and you really emphasized that, it is a portfolio approach to do this, because there's more than just effluent in these streams, and what other factors influence the flow and the quality, and you have to look at all of those, that whole portfolio approach to look out at best management. So that's exciting to see, and look forward to more of that in the future. Okay, so now to transition to the last thing, policy changes, a small little topic here. So the event was organized, this whole event was organized in part to discuss policy improvements that are necessary to prepare for the sector for a more volatile future, where we're likely to have more frequent and intense drought. Education the young. I say he stays here. Okay, what are one or two policy improvements you see need to be taken by your agency or the state to prepare the wastewater sector for this kind of uncertain, more volatile, I won't say scary, future? All right. Do you want to start, Adam?
Yeah, I think this is a really important step, right? Casting light on this issue. As you said, in the past it's been sort of an ancillary issue because of the emergency drought situation, but just having the state look at this and acknowledge the impact. So as there are conversations about increased water conservation, decreasing indoor water usage, that it's acknowledged at every step of the way that yes, this will have impacts. And so we need to look at those. We need to understand what's appropriate, and at what point are we getting diminishing returns from water conservation, but having impacts on our wastewater systems for things they weren't intended to do. So I think that's a huge step, is just having the information out there just like this. Another one I mentioned is funding, right? I mean, there's a lot of innovative projects out there. There's a lot of information to be gathered. There's a lot of things to be done and not necessarily enough money to do it. So if the state were willing to contribute more funding to those types of efforts, we would be all for it, of course. Those are probably the big ones. And then just thinking about flexibility. So knowing what we don't know, knowing that we're moving into the future, not knowing what our flow situation is going to be, not knowing what the extent of climate change impacts are going to be to our system, we operate under a regulatory regime that is very strict and is very sort of, we know what this is, here are your limits, here's what's going on. The reality is very different from that regime. And so building flexibility, I think Nina called it a buffer in some cases where you're talking to wastewater agencies, building that into how you're regulated would be a huge step in the right direction.
So I want to come back to this issue of flexibility, though, in terms of what are some ideas or examples of that, but let's move down and then we'll come back to that.
This is a loaded question, but it's a great one. So I think that there's a few spaces that we think are pretty important from the water standpoint, potable drinking water standpoint, and that is really trying to put as much effort forward, and we are making a great effort with the IPR, DPR regulations. Because once we get that going on the other side, and as long as we're keeping in mind the impact to the wastewater side, and we're looking at those regulations side by side, making sure they can work well together, And the reason being is, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to have an effect, especially if and when DPR takes flight and we end up recirculating back into the systems. Now we're going to be reintroducing, DPR, highly purified water, into drinking water systems that will find their way back through a collection system and into a wastewater treatment plant. So it's really an interesting life cycle. It really is one water at its best. But then how that effectuates both changes in our watershed, how that effectuates the discharge into those streams and creeks. I mean, there's kind of a number of items we need to keep in mind outside of just the infrastructure portion, which is very important because that's the cost portion. But just how do you bring that together? And I really think the planning is important, technology is really important, and the funding that can be put into technology to find a way forward for wastewater facilities and purified water systems to look at better ways to treat and handle any of those quality issues. Quantity is going to be a real interesting infrastructure question. We've got huge, pipes that are already running through our systems today, whether it's wastewater or drinking water. How do you make the best use of that existing infrastructure? Or when you go to rehab it, how do you rehab it or build upon it in a way that makes fiscal sense? At the end of the day, it's the rate base or the public that's paying for this. So we want to make the best, decision for them on their behalf as it relates to that infrastructure build out into the future. Knowing that, we want to work closely with the regulators to find the paths where we're going to have that synergy and it's going to work well together so that we make the right decisions today.
Thank you.
I liked hearing from Adam and Nina, and I think your question about the policy improvements for the volatile future, I mean, it really just kind of brings out the fact that the stark reality is that we are in a volatile present. I mean, we've gone through the extremes literally over the past 5 years, from little to no precipitation to extreme precipitation. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because collectively as a society, I think we need to get a handle on the greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the impacts, which at this point are inevitable. Otherwise, these costs and unknowns are just going to multiply in emergency response. And that said, the policy improvements, I think we have an opportunity here. I mean, first one would probably be take a holistic look at the wastewater sector. There has been a trend in the industry to start to look at the waste stream from something to treat as a resource to recover. And so in addition to recycled water, there's nutrients and energy to recover from that stream. And I think as we move forward, this really is something that we should remember. We can accomplish more than one thing as we are preparing for what we are facing today and what's coming in the future. I guess an example is that municipal wastewater treatment plants can play a role in supporting states' greenhouse gas emission reduction goals by accepting food diverted from landfills for co-digestion. On one hand, we are avoiding those fugitive emissions from landfills, and on the other hand, facilities have the potential benefit to meet their on-site energy demands, generating more biomethane. So that's definitely a big, we shouldn't zoom in on just one issue, but like if we're making these investments, let's make them climate smart from multiple standpoints. And I think the other one is more collaboration and definitely in improving the preparedness. Obviously, with the tools that the regulatory agency has, we can do a lot. But I think having a conversation and transparently looking at all our options and trade-offs of different policy options is the way to go. And in general, we are looking to do a statewide wastewater sector climate change survey to assess where the needs are and what sort of resources we can allocate to help. But it has to be something that's holistically looking at how we are investing and what we are regulating and having a conversation about that.
So because you brought this up, and Adam and Nina, you also kind of alluded to this about both energy and fish survival rates, et cetera. The policy space then, when we think about that, we have the Association of Sanitation Agencies, we've got a water agency, we've got the State Water Resource Control Board. Who's missing from this discussion, or typically, maybe not today, but generally speaking, are we missing some other government agencies or local regional agencies that should be part of this discussion?
I would say I think that's an excellent point, Layman, about the relationship of accepting food waste diversion. And I think we as an organization and our members work a lot with CalRecycle to work on the organics diversion mandates. We also work with the state air board and local air boards because we do have these digestion facilities. They are producing energy, they are having emissions. And so, we deal with CalRecycle side, we deal with the air emissions side, we deal with the water board. So pretty much every environmental agency there is within Cal EPA, we go to them for different things. And so having them as part of that conversation is really important.
Mm-hmm.
I would actually add the federal side. So one area that really interests the recycled water community right now is, as we're looking at future uses for purified water, we've done a lot with source control on the wastewater side and through the state board. And could there be more? Of course, we can always make some improvements. But really, when you start looking at consumption and public health, you have to look at how the chemicals and the products are made. And so there is a huge push to look at federal aspects like TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, to better understand if that can effectuate or provide any new ways of thinking about the development of personal care products, pharmaceuticals, CECs within the wastewater that eventually makes its way to potentially a drinking water source. So that's another layer I would say that's equally important as well.
I can just add that one of the entities is here, PPIC. Mm-hmm. Definitely organizations that are examining what happened when we are not in a state of emergency, charting out what the challenges are, articulating some possible ways forward. It's a very important step. So thank you really again for pulling together this report. And there are a lot of research organizations from academia to various reuse foundations that are doing research. And so although as a regulatory agency we don't do research ourselves, we want to have the science-based decisions and those organizations involved in this conversation, because we absolutely have to be basing our decisions and where we're moving forward on science and on data. Mm-hmm.
So to take some heat off the state for a second, and Adam gave us a good out there, the federal government. I mean, a lot of these effluent-dominated streams have threatened and endangered species into them. And so when you're talking about investments and funding and such, do you feel that someone else should maybe pick up their game a bit? I mean, there's a similar argument down in the Salton Sea. Is this a similar case here that, we need these investments to protect a lot of these species like the Santa Ana sucker in Southern California? Do we need more funding for these large investments that provide public goods, et cetera?
I'd say as a general statement, money's always good.
Yeah.
The feds have more of it than the states. So,
that's an easy one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's an easy one, right?
Yeah. But do you see them, I mean, is there collaboration and coordination about these sorts of investments, or is it really kind of segmented?
I think so. I think it's important to have them involved because ultimately in a lot of issues they do have the final say, and so you can have this great project that might work, but if you do have ESA issues or if you don't have the funding to address certain things, it's not going to get done. So yeah, it's very important to have, I think, the federal side involved.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I echo what Adam has to say. I mentioned TSCA earlier, but I think funding is actually a huge place where the federal government has a huge play. I know we have a WIFIA loan that was just awarded to one of the wastewater treatment plants in our service area, which I thought was a great step in the right direction. We also have various Title 16 dollars that are available. So I mean, there is a huge role that could be played through funding and providing more to California for those important build-outs and needs on both the wastewater and drinking water side as well.
I agree. Money is always good at strengthening our working relationship with federal government and all levels, really. We're talking about here so many levels, absolutely can help.
Great. So before we open it up to questions from the audience, and when we do that, please wait for the microphone to come to you because we have an online crowd as well. But before we do that, I kind of want to summarize some of the main kind of points that I've heard here. First of all, it seems like there has to be an increase in information exchange, not only between agencies in the state, but between agencies, wastewater agencies, water users, and now even other agencies outside the water arena. There can be an increase in collaboration. Certainly, because there's externalities right now. Devolution has created these little pockets, but water goes across these pockets. and therefore, this devolution has created this problem where, my actions affect somebody else's, but my ratepayers are thinking about my actions and how when the money they're paying for my actions, but they have these unintended consequences downstream or upstream. So more efforts into collaboration. We need more investments in flexibility, both within the agency sector, but also from a policy and a regulatory sector. And then we have to do a better job at understanding the consequences of changes in wastewater use or changes in water use, and particularly as we ended up here on the environment, both a quality and quantity framework. And I'm not sure we're very close to understanding those types of consequences or trade-offs. So that's certainly a need for more collaboration and more research in that area. Is there any other major point you want to add to that list?
Yeah,
Okay.
good.
And just because it's not that I really thought of all that, that's all in the report. So thanks, Caitrin and Henry. Okay, so let's thank our panelists. And we've got 15 minutes for questions. So.
Since demand always seems to expand to meet the supply, I'm wondering how much thought's being given to trading water, sanitary water that's been treated, trading that rather than letting that be released into streams, trading that for higher remaining flows in streams and less withdrawal from streams. Use the water in the community, maybe run it through groundwater recharge, but allow a little bit more water to stay in the streams. Let that not be the last choice. Thank you.
So in our planning efforts right now, we are looking specifically at wastewater systems and going into IPR, so going into the groundwater for recharge there and then to be pumped out later. We're also looking at the potential space. We are now starting to move into more of the conversation of DPR because it is becoming such an interesting topic. We haven't specifically looked at, as part of that planning effort, introducing into streams and creeks at this time. We do have a lot of requirements as it relates to discharge into creeks, and so we would want to be mindful and work very closely with the cities, the land use agencies, because that gets into stormwater requirements as well, if we were to start to introduce additional water. But I mean, that's definitely a space that I would welcome a conversation, and I would actually say additional research for our service area would be prudent before going down that road, just to make sure we wouldn't effectuate any negative or adverse impacts to the environment, but certainly a potential space to look into, for sure.
And I'm not sure if this goes exactly to your point, but I think a good example of conceptually what you're talking about would be something like the South County Ag Project that SAC Regional is doing right now, where they're delivering recycled water to certain areas in the hopes that the groundwater levels will rise, and there's enough environmental benefit to that whole scheme of what that's going on there that's worth a lot of federal funding. And so I think that's an example where it's not necessarily your discharge, but it is a benefit to recycled water that has ancillary benefits related to water supply.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself as well, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jeff, an advocate. In this term of wastewater, I'm thinking of two old projects. One is in Los Angeles, dealing with the Tillman, should we say, processing plant, and where recycling water. Did there ever come up the dual water supply of usage? In other words, for the toilets and everything else, has that ever occurred? The other one I'm thinking of is dealing with the Chico and that, should we say, recycling operation that has been very efficient for a very, very long time and millions of gallons. But for you guys, I will say incentive seems to work better than fines. Are you beginning to have to utilize fines to get that increased level of water, as well as all the other stuff of dealing with water treatment levels?
I'll take a stab at that. I want to say that the state has funded, as Adam mentioned, over $1 billion in grants and loans to encourage recycled water projects. We do want wherever is suitable for that to actually continue. And only recently, at the end of 2018, the State Water Board has updated its recycled water use recycled water policy to really maximize the water recycling in areas where the groundwater is in the state of overdraft, and also to increase diversity of the community supply and to mitigate for the impacts of climate change. And so we are looking to incentivize recycled water, and we are leaving it up to the agencies to decide what's suitable for them. And we're not really fining somebody for not deciding to recycle, but we are definitely wanting to see that reuse and maximizing the precious resource that water is in California.
In our space as a water wholesaler, we don't necessarily impose fines for water use per se. It's actually on the local land use agency to impose those. However, I would say we use the incentivized approach. So we do look at and we provide, countywide rebates and conservation incentives across the board for lawn conversions to fixtures to devices in the home. So I would definitely say we go the incentivized approach just because of the nature of the agency we are, but I do know some other agencies have a little bit more tools in their bucket, so to speak, in order to actually utilize the finer enforcement if need be.
Yeah, I just agree. I think in this space, carrots work much better than sticks.
Great. Good question. Thank you.
My question's about the agriculture industry's use of recycled water. How are those sources identified by the agricultural industry? And then how does that water get on the fields? Is it piped separately, or is it blended, or how does that work?
Thank you. Oh, did you want to introduce yourself? Your name?
My name, Pete Martineau.
Oh, thank you.
We do have ag in our service area. We currently do not use recycled water for agricultural purposes. However, we have used it for small uses for little gardens, community gardens, so to speak. And so I can speak to that. Title 22, the regulations within the state do allow for that application and use, even for vegetation that's used for consumption. It does have to follow very strict requirements for application. It could be drip, it can be spray, but there are some very specific testings that need to take place to make sure it doesn't commingle with the drinking water system or the regular pipes that might be nearby. So that's the application we deal with today within our service area. I do know there are some pretty large projects that recently happened in the Central Valley where they have taken recycled water and put it to application for ag, which is really great to see, as that we're really expanding that outside of just urban spaces as well.
Thank you.
Paul Causey, and I'm on the board of directors of the Central Contra Costa Sanitary District. A couple of observations. One is that one of the things that we're working on right now is when the governor stopped all golf course use, we're looking at the possibility of providing decentralized treatment for golf courses in our service area. How does the panel feel about it? Looks to me a little bit like we're going to maybe moving away from centralized regional systems and more maybe into decentralized systems. I think in the future that is a new philosophy that hasn't been looked at or thought much about. The other issue that I would say and raise is relates to the conversations and collaborations between water and wastewater agencies. Having been in this business for a long time, I think one of the issues that gets in the way is the duplication of service law that allows water districts to have the final say about the use of recycled water in many cases. And I think that should be reviewed and looked at to determine whether that is a barrier to allowing conversations between the one water agencies that are out there and the one sub water agencies that are there, because I think collaboration is a huge part of getting this one water concept moving forward. And if we can't figure out how to talk together because we're worried about the dollars that are involved, I think that, and I know for our case, we've been working on recycling, or trying to, for 25 years, and one of our biggest issues has to do with the duplication of service problem that we have with the water agencies in our area. So I think that should be again looked at to determine whether there's anything can do to further incentivize agencies to really talk and not stand away and say, it's not my problem.
Thank you.
Just to answer the first question about decentralized systems, we have seen a lot more of those. That seems to be a trend lately. I think it can work in a number of areas, like you mentioned, golf courses. I think one concern that some folks have expressed is that some of these systems can be operated where it draws the water, but then puts the actual loadings back into the system. And so it exacerbates the problem we've been talking about all day about low flows. Well, they're taking the water out, leaving the flow or leaving the loads in, and then that ends up at the treatment plant. So kind of you'll see a lot more of those problems, the more decentralized systems that you have, unless it's done in kind of a coordinated manner. So that's something that our members have talked about in the past. And the duplication of service, yeah, I mean, I think everyone agrees there needs to be more communication between water and wastewater agencies, and that we need to find ways to make it work in areas where folks may be reluctant to pursue those projects on the water side.
I would definitely say decentralized systems versus centralized is such an interesting topic. We're evaluating it right now because we do have a lot of high-tech companies that are highly interested in green building and specifically seeking out LEED. They're oftentimes looking for how can they take their facility to the next level, and that includes taking and using the existing wastewater or gray water within their sites and then repurposing them for additional use on site for landscape. And so instead of it being introduced into or discharged into the wastewater facility, which then can go to a centralized facility for distribution back out, they would like to do it on site. It's an interesting area right now because as we see it, it really gets into how cities want to effectuate different ordinances and laws that would allow or permit this type of use. And so being a wholesale agency, we have to allow that kind of dialogue to play out. But at the same time, of course, we have some concerns, but we also don't want to necessarily prohibit or say, like, we don't think it's a good idea to be reusing that water, because really, at the end of the day, we're trying to find ways and mechanisms to continue to use water wisely and apply it wisely. If a site is doing that, are they meeting kind of the end goal of reusing? They're just doing it at a different scale. So I guess it's just more of a scale question. I think the same end goal is trying to be achieved. So philosophically, that's important to us. But it gets kind of into the infrastructure question, what Adam was raising about, well, what does that do in terms of biosolids, or solids going down into the collection system, being introduced in the plant? It changes the treatment processes or the impacts of quality that you may see in the wastewater effluent. So I think those are kind of, eventually, those are the huge policy trade-offs that folks will have to figure out, both at the local level and, eventually maybe the state, but that also gets into, the land use agency, the agency that owns the asset and how they want to proceed in that direction. So a lot of interesting conversations that need to evolve, and I think every service area is a little different. So you'll find each of them do it differently. SF has been able to do it. San Francisco has been able to do it quite well. And then we're starting to see it kind of start to happen a bit more in our area as well.
Did you want anything?
I agree with everything Nina said. It's a really interesting area. I think decentralized treatment and on-site water reuse are seen as a way to strengthen our resilience. So we are looking at San Francisco and locally where these things are happening. It's a model to keep in mind, and I don't know if there is going to be a push to have it more widespread, but where people have done it, it's a wise use of water. Obviously, the challenges that are then on the centralized end, where it's treating more concentrated influent into the facilities, something to be taken into account. And it's, again, an opportunity to have a conversation so that the agency is not all of a sudden seeing things change in the influent without actually having had opportunity to have discussion and to plan for that change. So,
yeah, it reminds me of there's a quote by a French economist who said that the difference between a good economist and a bad economist is the bad economist doesn't think about the unintended consequences. and I think it's a great idea, the decentralization, but the devil's in the detail in terms of looking at the unintended consequences of it. But just requires science-based analyses and research and collaborations. Great question, thanks.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Nicholas Chow. I work at UCLA as a researcher on wastewater, recycled water, DPR, and water energy nexus. And the question that I have for you today is about capital investment. And we talked today a lot about flexible infrastructure. I'm wondering if you can provide us with some examples of what counts as flexible infrastructure, and what are the drawbacks of investing in that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you mean by flexible infrastructure. And what types of things are you thinking about?
Asking you folks, I don't know. We talked today a lot about flexible investments maybe as opposed to flexible infrastructure.
Yeah, so flexible investments, allows you to choose which infrastructure. I wish there was a magic box where you could, recycled water one day and something else the next. But I think, flexible investments, I think spreading it across, a lot of it's already being done. I mean, in terms of, stormwater capture issues, that's dealt with in one area. Those that are deciding to recycle water in another area. I think that's probably the most flexible.
I would say it actually goes into the mind. We as an agency, we've begun to actually hire on more wastewater engineers, even though we're a drinking water, wholesale water agency. And so we're actually really trying to bring in different knowledge and information into a 90-year agency that's been doing just drinking water. I would also say that from an infrastructure perspective, when we go into our planning, we are starting to push that envelope and kind of ask ourselves if we lay this, trunk potable drinking water line or an IPR line, or we're going to lay an effluent line or a brine discharge line, is there a possibility to convert that later? We've actually been asking ourselves that question. And so we're not at the project level yet, but we're at the planning stage where I'm really throwing out some really out-of-the-box ideas and just want to test them with the team and see is there different ways that we might be able to build it in a way that's creative. We've also been looking at P3's private-public partnerships, which is incredibly different delivery method as well. To see if we can effectuate or bring in some other ideas from globally from other companies that have been around the world, or folks that might be able to bring on other types of technology that isn't really something that we're applying today within our service area. So there's a couple things we're trying to do to just take traditional capital planning to the next level, so to speak. But so those are some thoughts we have right now.
For me, I think the flexibility would come from looking at what's happening regionally. I think sometimes assessing the cost and benefit and uses will depend what's going to be the outcome, because we might experience higher treatment cost or greenhouse gas emissions if we're recycling than if we're just getting some imported water. But statewide, avoiding that imported water that can have really high energy intensity associated in it and embedded energy, I think we would be able to statewide maybe cut the greenhouse gas emissions, while locally maybe the cost is greater and emissions are greater. But it's kind of really taking a big picture and having flexibility in also making those kinds of calls where we are shifting the portfolio locally and achieving something statewide. I think flexibility can come from many different levels of considering this issue, and I think this is a really good question.
Yeah, and just using my authority as the moderator here, that's a great question. What we talk about in the report as well is if you think about a large urban area that's going to collect a lot of wastewater and then reuse it, the demand for that wastewater and the supply varies over time. They don't always meet, so you'd want to make sure you have the right amount of storage to store the wastewater in that sense, so it can be flexibly used when it's needed the most. So that would be another way to think about flexibility. Great question. Thank you. Okay, last question. Oh.
I'll only do it if nobody else has a burning one.
Is there a burning question? Or another?
All right. So I'm in a panic.
They're very polite, Ellen.
And I just wanted to come back to the funding issue to give. I mean, maybe some of the folks in the audience are fully aware of this, but I thought it'd be helpful to highlight a little bit because you all say yes, more money is always great, but some of the tools that you were talking about are actually not super expensive tools for the taxpayer. They're more about kind of make ways to leverage capital markets and just make financing cheaper, sort of let you get money at lower interest rates, which can be really helpful for keeping these projects affordable. So if, I don't know, any of you on the panel wanted to elaborate a little bit, sort of to decode for folks what WIFIA does, or sort of some of the state revolving fund lending.
I'll go on this note. It's very expensive to develop wastewater for recycled water uses, plain and simple, whether it be for MPR, which is purple pipe use for irrigation, dual plumbed use, or it's for purified water to be utilized for future IPR and or DPR uses. So when you look at the recycled water world, it is for us the most expensive water supply to develop and or have and operate. And so we know it's very difficult. And in fact, in our recent rate case that we put forward for a discussion with our cities, there was a lot of discussion about the rates, the water rates. And I know wastewater agencies have this same challenge, is you don't, especially with aging infrastructure, you have to replace what you have today, but then you have to think smart about if you go to develop this really expensive supply, how do you do that when you know there's only so much the community can afford? Granted, we live in an affluent area, but we still have disadvantaged people that live within our area or folks that can't afford everything. And so, and I know other communities across the state have the same issue, if not worse. And so the question becomes, how can we, like you said, do smart investment or look at creative ways to get there and actually be able to do this? We're huge advocates. We actually have done an exceptional job with some of our footprint as it relates to carbon footprint, and we've utilized green energy for our existing operations. It does come at a cost, though, too. So ways that we can effectuate and get additional dollars from the government, whether it be the state or the federal government, and WIFIA is a program offered by the federal government. It's a low interest rate loan to the agency that wants to take on a large capital project, under which you can then also defer the payments until you're in operation, which makes sense because a lot of times you're not going to see the revenue associated with that investment until you're in operation. So that's just one example, but there are many different programs out there available, and that's why we kept saying funding was so important, because these are big, huge regional systems. Lots of expense goes into just keeping them going, let alone developing them to the next generation and for future generations to come.
And I think, unfortunately, I use more money as a shorthand for all those things, which includes cheaper money at lower interest rates. I think when the board did the $700 million of recycled water loans at 1%, there was huge demand for that because making it at 1% made those projects viable, whereas the same amount of money at a higher interest rate may not have made that project viable. I think it also includes things like you were mentioning with WIFIA, where the payback term isn't until you actually need the money. That's incredibly helpful. So there's all kinds of things you can do in terms of receiving funding that aren't necessarily about the exact dollar amount that's allocated, but the way in which the funding is distributed and how it's done.
And I will just add, I think you're kind of getting at that the tools to make better investments themselves may not be as expensive as the infrastructure is, and we need to use all our available tools to make smart infrastructure investment. I do just want to say that the state revolving funds are actually for infrastructure strictly. So that's what we use them for as the State Water Board, and to allocate them differently or expand the purposes, we would need change to federal law through Congress. So until then, we're going to have to work through however we can to fund development of the tools and research and science, but that's where the funding is.
Great, thank you. And I think that that concludes our session here. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all the guests. Appreciate you coming and your input.